Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to another video in my series, Books That Ended Friendships. These are a series of videos about books that ended friendships between authors. This week's entry involves a book called The New Russia, written by Dorothy Thompson, and how it ended the friendship between Sinclair Lewis and Theodore Dreiser. So, Sinclair Lewis and Theodore Dreiser, to call them friends is a bit of a stretch, and so this is one reason why I've hesitated to make this one. But the story of how their friendship, let's just say their professional relationship, or their admiration for one another, or their maybe just, polite ability to tolerate one another came to an end, it's just too juicy to kind of pass up. So if you don't know, Sinclair Lewis was an American writer who grew up in Minnesota. He had kind of a difficult childhood. He was an unusual young person for kind of the rough and tumble small town Minnesota where he grew up. And he later went on then to become a writer, writing such classics of American literature as Main Street and Babbitt and Elmer Gantry and Aerosmith, and I'm forgetting at least one. And early on, he seemed like, he would be an author whose works really lasted. Theodore Dreiser was actually older than Sinclair Lewis and had also published some fairly monumental works. By the time we get to, this conflict between the two, Dreiser had grown up in Indiana, and he had written Sister Carrie, which was his first book, and then An American Tragedy, which was considered to be a major achievement in American literature in the early 1900s. Both men shared some things in common. Particularly, they kind of shared left-leaning politics. It would be a stretch to call either one of them a socialist or a communist or anything like that, but they shared kind of some left-leaning politics, particularly when it came to representing the issues that capitalism posed to ordinary people, the working man, how it affected small-town society, etc., how it warped people's morals. And so they kind of were similar people of a similar age, writing books about similar topics. And so they had that kind of background together. Lewis had expressed his admiration for Dreiser's writing in the past, and they kind of had this mutual, admiration, friendship for one another. In 1927, Sinclair Lewis met and married a woman named Dorothy Thompson, who was a working journalist who had, up until 1920, been active in the women's suffrage movement, and then after that had become a journalist, traveling to Europe and mainly kind of bouncing around Germany and those areas, and had a real kind of affinity when back in the United States for German immigrants and kind of European issues. And she was an independent person who, was a practicing and relatively well-known journalist when she met Sinclair Lewis. They met casually, then Lewis threw a party for her, and then they ended up getting married. And so that's kind of how things went. Then in 1928, Dorothy Thompson and Theodore Dreiser were invited to travel around Russia. This is after the Russian Revolution, and Russia's now a communist nation. They were invited by the Russian government to be part of a delegation that would travel around Russia and kind of report back to the West about, how Russia had changed and what Russia was like. In some ways, probably to kind of repair some of the image that Russia had in the United States. And they both went, which means that, Dorothy Thompson and Theodore Dreiser were, definitely together in the same group of people at that time while traveling around. By this time, of course, Lewis was married to Dorothy Thompson. At one point, he actually travels to Moscow to be with his wife because he missed her. By the way, you should also know, if you didn't know this about Sinclair Lewis, he was an alcoholic. And, if you read a biography of Sinclair Lewis, and for some reason I've read too, if you read a biography of Sinclair Lewis, it's hard to find an occasion, a major occasion in his life in which he wasn't drinking, drunk, etc. He drank a lot. It's actually kind of remarkable, I think, that he lived as long as he did, being the kind of alcoholic that he was. And when he was drinking, he was unpleasant. He wasn't a jovial, good-natured drunk. He was an angry, mean-spirited drunk. Anyway, so Lewis and Thompson and Dreiser go to Russia, and they come back. Lewis's wife had been writing a series of articles while she was in Russia, and those articles were collected into a book called The New Russia by Dorothy Thompson, and she published that book in 1928, and it got fairly good reviews. Well, Dreiser published a book that same year called Dreiser Looks at Russia, and when a friend of Lewis's who had read Dorothy's book, read Dreiser's book, he found that Dreiser had copied, word for word, passages from Dorothy Thompson's work. Now, Dorothy Thompson assumed that one of his research assistants or somebody working for him had read her articles and had almost kind of inadvertently given those passages to Dreiser, and Dreiser included them relatively innocently. Lewis, being Lewis, was not willing to let that go. And so he contacted a lawyer, and they sent a letter to Dreiser, and there was the beginnings of this lawsuit then for plagiarism. Now, I don't think there's any doubt that Dreiser's book contains word-for-word passages and descriptions that came from Thompson's book. So Dreiser here is clearly in the wrong. But in the course of kind of this back and forth before legal action was taken, Dreiser implied that, Dorothy Thompson might have actually read his notes and stolen his information after a visit to his hotel room while they were in Moscow in Russia without Lewis. This then creates this deep enmity between the two. Lewis and his wife basically called Dreiser a plagiarist. Dreiser has implied that he might have slept with Sinclair Lewis's wife, and things are really bad. So, that in and of itself kind of brings the friendship, the admiration to an end. Probably what added the tension between Dreiser and Lewis is that in 1930, Sinclair Lewis became the first American to win a Nobel Prize for Literature instead of Dreiser. And certainly, when the Nobel Committee was looking at American authors, certainly Dreiser probably was in that conversation. But Lewis is the one who won, and that could not have sat well with Theodore Dreiser. So there's all this tension between the two, which, for a few years appears to have died down, but they hadn't really been in one another's company before, until both attended a dinner, like a banquet kind of thing, dinner held by, I believe, the Metropolitan Club in New York City in 1931. In 1931, Dreiser and Lewis and Dorothy Thompson, by the way, are in the same place. And while they're not the ones being honored, because Lewis was Nobel laureate, he was asked to speak, and he stood up and he basically said something along the lines of, "I'm disinclined to share my thoughts with a group of people that contains the son of a bitch who stole my wife's work." Well, clearly he's referring to Dreiser, and Dreiser was there. When the speech was over and the banquet was breaking up, Dreiser confronted Lewis and demanded that he take back this charge of plagiarism. Lewis repeated the charge, and Dreiser punched him or slapped him. Lewis goes down. People, because Lewis had been drinking, because he was Sinclair Lewis, Lewis is kind of propped back up on his feet, and Dreiser says, essentially, "I dare you to say it again." And Lewis said it again, so Dreiser punched him or slapped him again. This is largely from Dreiser's own words, that he punched Lewis at least twice, and that definitely brought their friendship to an end for his part, and kind of, I think, one of the things that is irritatingly endearing about Sinclair Lewis, and maybe because of his drinking, Lewis didn't hold a grudge. In 1942, Lewis helps Dreiser receive recognition from, I believe, the American Academy of Letters, and continued to be an admirer of his work. Dreiser, not so kind, involving Lewis. Anyway, their friendship came to an end over that book, such as it was, and I thought that made an interesting story. Anyway, I look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.